Hey, it's news from heaven. We are all created for eternal life if we use the means of salvation. I just picture myself saying that title like maybe I'm a substitute teacher and I'm like, now wait, class, we are all created. Or if I'm like trying to talk to my teenage child and their friends, now we are all created for eternal life. But it is cool. No, it is cool because eternal life is not actually at all about the continuation of consciousness. Everybody can just be conscious. Right now we have an abundance of consciousness, right? What we're looking at is real life. Like everyone's got a life, but if you say, I have no life, you're not talking about you don't exist. You're talking about it's not full of the things that bring joy and whatever it is that you're looking for. So that's the eternal life that we're trying to figure out here. And the means of salvation, if we're looking at, there's this life here, and it's not something that occurs in great scarcity that you guys, it's not like the Holy Grail or some whatever Indiana Jones was looking for. It's not something you got to go and seek and find somewhere. It's everywhere, right? But we have essentially obstructions in the way. So what do you do to get rid of things? Well, when I want to get rid of, let's say I've drawn these black clouds just coming in and messing up our minds like I always draw, how do I get salvation from those? Well, I use the means. Like I click over here to my erase tool, right? Because if you don't use the means of salvation, if you just keep using this black line, it's just going to get black linear and linear and linear. But if you use the means of salvation, right, this tool that specifically can accomplish this task, yeah, things can be cleared up. And if you want to say this is a extension of those means, but I'd say these were already there. So my metaphor is breaking down already. We haven't even gotten into the text yet. Briefly put, faith, and come on, how are you going to not want to have a clear definition of faith and goodwill? I mean, talk about creating demand and then creating the supply, because if you try to go through Swedenborg, you're going to get very familiar with him talking about faith and goodwill. And what actually are those things? I'm not a 1750s Protestant. I don't know what you're talking about. Let's get a little insight. Briefly put, faith is believing that people who live good lives and believe the right things are saved by the Lord. Okay. So it's some kind of assurance in the God's ability to dispel those clouds, to give this eternal life that we're talking about. And I think we're going to get even farther into a definition of it there. We are created for eternal life. I told you, man. And I'm not just talking about continued existence. We are created for happiness. Heaven is not just, I get to keep, my body's died and so I'm still conscious. That's great. Heaven is something that you can start here anytime. This is the cessation of the anxiety and disquiet that comes from believing the wrong things, not having faith. And when I'm talking about right and wrong things, no, I'm never going to start writing on the text. I'm only going to lecture you this time. Because when I'm talking about believing right things versus believing wrong things, you might say, man, well, you believe I can't, play dice games and, drive a convertible. Right things and wrong things. How about this for the wrong things? How many people believe that they are worthless or flawed in some way, right? Is that the right thing or the wrong thing? How many people believe that life is pointless and that evil is powerful and there's no justice in the world, and that human beings are not worth your time to bother with? Like there's all kinds of wrong things that everybody knows. Believing those is a problem. So if we can get this eternal life, it's full of seeing the truth. It's when that moment, because we think of religious stuff in some boring box of boringness. Do we, or do we like it? I like parts of it for sure, but it's easy to think of. That's why I was making fun of this title. Is it just out there? But when you actually experience the living feeling of believing the right thing, when you get to that like extremely noble and charismatic experience of, I get what this person really needs. Something new about what love is. What it is to lay down your pride for something. That's the kind of stuff that movies crescendo into. It is really cool. So to get that right belief to really see people for what they are, to understand ourselves, to understand God, to understand life for what it is. Believing the right things is actually super cool. We are created for that. Like, that is this where we're in right now, this uneternal life, we're relatively asleep. This is the aberration that you can tell just going through life. Like, this is just weird. Why is life like this? Why are the dark clouds all around? Why is stuff such a labor to do? Eternal life, again, you can be in that when you're here. That's where our home is. Like, that's where we should be. And we're all out of time. All of us are capable of inheriting it. Provided, I said, if we use, that's from Cinderella, right? We use in our lives the means of salvation that have been prescribed for us in the Word. So just like that eraser tool, we got to get these means rolling. On these points, all Christians agree, as do all non-Christians who have religion and sound reason. So you gotta, I don't know, do you agree? You gotta use, we can all get there. We just gotta use the means. And not everyone agrees that. Some people think, I don't need to go into it, but there's only a specific group. I guess people would all say that that's disagreeing about the means, but I think people generally like to write off other groups of people. There are indeed many means of being saved. Tell me about these means. I gotta know what's up with these means. There are indeed many means of being saved, but each and every one of them relates to living a good life and believing the right things. There we have faith and goodwill. So living a good life, believing the right things. And again, right things, there's nothing that's not cool about accuracy. Therefore, they all relate to goodwill and faith. For goodwill is living a good life, and faith is believing the right thing. So there's that definition. Yeah, wasn't that so satisfying? You got faith, believing the right things, goodwill, living a good life. These two universal categories of means of being saved, goodwill and faith, are not just prescribed for us in the Word, they are commanded. Okay, so these, all the means by which we can be saved fit into these two great buckets, goodwill and faith, which is goodwill is living a good life. Faith is right beliefs. And we talked in the last episode, about how you can have false beliefs, but you're still coming from a good motive. And this is immediately anybody would get, like, hey, you accidentally ruined my something. Oh, I wasn't trying. I thought that did it. It changes. You forgive them, or you try. So in here, somehow, there's all these little messages about how to live a good life. They can all be grouped under the goodwill side. And all these little bits, I usually use the opposite colors for this. It's irrelevant. This all together, these are what propel us up to this eternal life, right? From the fact, these are not just prescribed for us, and these two universal categories, means of being saved, goodwill and faith, I don't know if I really focus on this, are not, there's my dot over there, are not just prescribed for us in the Word, they are commanded. You gotta get in there and to be nice and seek the truth. That's not too onerous. From the fact they are commanded, it follows that goodwill and faith give us the capacity of providing ourselves with eternal life through a power that is assigned and given to us by God. Yeah, why are we in this equation? Can God do that stuff? But somehow we're providing ourselves. We get a power that's assigned and given to us by God. So God is doing it, but is doing it through us. There's definitely, what I'm seeing here is there is a role that we play, right? I was going to write role somewhere, but there's no room, so I'll write role here, and you'll know that I'm talking about that stuff. There's a role that we play. The more we use that power and look to God, the more God increases the power until he turns every aspect of our earthly goodwill into spiritual goodwill, and every aspect of our earthly faith into spiritual faith. In this way, God brings dead goodwill and faith to life and brings us to life as well. Okay, So the good news is we get to expand on my drawing. The bad news is we're dead. I mean, right now, we're relatively lifeless. Didn't I say we're not in this eternal life? If you think of life as, are you conscious? Okay, we're conscious, sure. To what extent are we just going through the motions, right? But eternal life is this total different level of heavenly happiness. So right now, we're outside eternal life, right? Unless you are, in which case, thanks anyway for tuning in. So, but this stuff can pull us up into this living goodwill and living faith that is full of these, bringing each of these little dots to life in us. So somehow we're exercising, through our exercising the power, we are somehow we're using these means, right? We're reaching in here, using them. Through that process, though, God, maybe this is just for my own clarity, I'm drawing this all out here, but what's God doing? The more we use that power and look to God, the more God increases the power until he turns every out. So the more that I guess that arrow, you know what? No. We are using these things to look at God. I mean, that's one way of reading that. So what we have, the beliefs that are, even though they're dead, they're in the right direction, meaning they don't have God's life in them. And even though we've got these, these sort of behavioral scripts that if we're using these and these are pushing us to look to God, which is to look to love to the neighbor and everything that comes out of God, then God is able to use that, is able to strengthen. What exactly he do here? God increases the power. Somehow God is building this up, and through that, converting all this into what is pictured above here. That is cool. I mean, the idea of strengthening it like a muscle, and the more we're using that, the more God is able to make it possible. So if it feels impossible now, just like if you've got a big, heavy something you can't lift, you go lift lighter things until you can lift that thing. Okay, I got it. I'll be using that power. Because eternal life is happening. I got to have eternal life. In this way, God brings dead goodwill and faith to life and brings us to life as well. And that sounds fun. Let's do it. Let's get brought to life. Two things have to come together before we can be said to be living a good life and believing the right things. Two things, that's it. What is it? In the church, these two things are called our inner self and our outer self. Okay? New characters emerge. We've got an inner self and we've got an outer self. When our inner self has good intentions and our outer self has good actions, then the two unite. That doesn't sound too mystical. Like, I get what you're talking about. You're talking about good, right motivations, character harmonizing with the persona you project and the things that you do. Easy said, not always so easy done, right? When our inner self has good intentions and our outer self has good actions, then the two unite. Our outer self acts from our inner self, and our inner self acts through our outer self. Okay, this is worth going over because, well, let me read this next clause. We're starting to get a convoluted picture of how we connect to God. We act from God and God acts through us. Sorry, I got to do that again because I don't know if I get it. Our outer self acts from our inner self. Yeah, why don't you just diagram it if you're so tough? Okay, so we got an outer self here and an inner self here. So our outer self is acting from our inner self. So the inner self is powering the outer self's ability to act. Our inner self acts through our outer self. So our outer self is acting from the inner, and the inner it's probably the same sort of action, but the inner is really kind of powering. Yeah, it's actually accomplishing its goals through the outer self here. So, right, we act from God and God acts through us. So our outer self is doing the exact same thing our inner self is doing the exact same thing that God is doing. And I think Swedenborg says this elsewhere, that really our inner self is God's, or is God. So there is this connection here that really that what's deepest at you in your core, that God's there. Doesn't mean I'm God, but it means that there's like somewhere in there, if you were just walking along through the inner dimensions of me, you'd be like, whoop, I ended up in God. When did I make that transition? It's somewhere around the inner self. So that no wonder once we who are much more in control of our outer self use this power to hook in with the inner self here, of course, you can start to get things brought to life. Because what is eternal life but getting God in the driver's seat, which is a much better situation than me in the driver's seat. I've gotten to try me in the driver's seat for a good long time now. I've had enough. Thank you. Our outer self, on the other hand, if our inner self has evil intentions, but our outer self still has good actions, nonetheless, both are acting from hell. Did you hear something? Our intentions come from hell and our actions are hypocritical. So, okay, I think there's a little complexity here, because while I do believe that God, there's a part in us, and Swedenborg does describe this, that is, it's the Lord is in here, right? And in a way that can't be taken out, right? So however you imagine God extending in, it's there. However, with Swedenborg, it's all about opening and closing. We can close things off to enough of an extent that the inner self actually is opening up to hell. And that is through evil intentions of all kinds. So you can have it so that either God is like fully present in your inner self, or hell is fully present in the inner self, and the outer self adopts the character of whichever one is there. Our intentions come from hell and our actions are hypocritical. It doesn't matter how good the stuff we're doing is, that can do good stuff for other people, so it's still good, but it's not bringing us to life. It's not bringing that eternal life. Our hellish intentions are inside every hypocritical thing we do, like a snake inside a plant or a grub inside a flower. Not that you can't, a lot of people can be well affected by that, but you can't say, okay, now I want this eternal life you're talking about. Because as we'll get to see, the point he's trying to make is, it's not just like an arbitrary act of God's preference. We have to build this spiritual, biomechanical connection point for God to us, or else you can't have that mindset of heaven. If people know not only, here we go. If people know not only that we have an inner and an outer self, but also what they are, and that the two can work together either actually or seemingly, and also that our inner self lives on after death, but our outer self is buried, they have access to an abundance of secrets about heaven and the world. So if you want to go ahead and ponder this some more, apparently that's a gateway that so much of life will snap into place if you get that. People who unite these two, meaning the inner and the outer self, in themselves for a good purpose, become happy forever. But people who divide them, or worse yet, if they unite them for an evil purpose, they are unhappy forever. You cannot be happy while misuniting this stuff. If people who lived, and this is Swedenborg, I think, pushing back against some Christian doctrine in his day. If people who lived good lives and believed the right things were not saved, and God could freely save or condemn on a whim anyone he wanted to, people who perished could justly accuse God of lacking mercy and compassion, or even of being vicious. And justly, that if it was just up to God, even if this whole thing, there's definitely the idea out there that life is kind of a test, and God is saying, like, do you pass or fail the morality test? And it's something that God is making some kind of decision, like has a preference for, or something like that. And Swedenborg is saying that if that were true, if God could just flick a switch or do a God thing and bring you into that eternal life, which, remember, is a state of mind. If he can do that, and he doesn't do it to everybody right now, we can justly say, well, you're really mean. You're really bad. Indeed, they could deny that God is God. Furthermore, they could argue that God said pointless things in his word and gave principles that were worthless and ridiculous. If you can just save anyone you want, why do you give all these instructions? So you can see if we are good enough to follow them. Just do it. Just bring us into heaven. So there's got to be something else going on here. For another thing, if people who live good lives and believe the right things were not saved, they could accuse God of violating the covenant that he made on Mount Sinai and wrote with his own finger on the 2 tablets. The only conclusion is that it's got to be that God cannot save us unless we use the means of salvation. And I think that the root of that is that saving us, eternal life, is not a matter of putting someone in a place. Heaven is a state of mind. And you can't, it must be even a divine impossibility to force somebody to enjoy and love things they don't want to love. Like, I can do a lot of things, but I cannot make you love something that you don't want to love. And so if we go around cultivating and loving the pleasure of evil, we're not going to want the pleasure of heaven. From the Lord's word in John, oops, that's a little too zoomed. From the Lord's words in John 14:21-24, it is clear that God cannot avoid saving people who live by his principles and have faith in him. Everyone who has religion and sound reason can provide arguments to support this by considering that God, who is constantly with us and gives us life and faculties of understanding and loving, cannot help loving us. There's no stopping God from loving. It doesn't matter if you reject the means for salvation. Rejecting the means for salvation is a pleasure preference. Like, it's because you say, I like the stuff that's against life. Like, that's what I want to be about. That's what I want to pursue. That's where I'm going. Doesn't mean that love isn't there, but cannot help loving us and being united to us in love if we live good lives and believe the right things. So this is on our part where we can have this uniting if we live the good lives. And if we use the means of salvation, that's when you're getting this, whatever this convoluted process is that I drew here. This can only happen if we put in the means of salvation. There's always going to be, no matter where we are or what we're doing, there's just always going to be this, like, God is always going to love us, but not just a feeling, but also be doing absolutely everything to make us as happy as we can be at any moment. Even people who are choosing to love and treasure and cherish and live in the worst things, you can imagine God is constantly making it so that they can have as happy a life as they can, given that they love those things. And so that's permanent, right? And I'm sure it goes along too with the feeling of love for us. But what God really wants to do is bring us into eternal life. Eternal life, again, is a specific condition which has to do with loving the Lord and loving the neighbor and loving the good of all. Oh yeah, this is a cool little ending here. If we live good lives and believe the right things. God has built this into every human being and every creature. Can a father and mother reject their babies? Can a bird reject its chicks? Can an animal reject its young? No, even tigers, panthers, or snakes are able to do this. No offense to these guys. Doing otherwise would be going against the design in which God exists and through which he acts, and going against the design he built into us at creation. God is not looking to push out anyone. And God can't get angry at someone or think like, I'm going to get revenge on you, or you have. I know people who think that God is like disappointed in them, or feels like, you're not worthy, or you're not good, or I'm not hanging out with you, you're dumb. That's impossible. But it's also the paradox, not the paradox, but the challenge that this text seems to be giving me is that it's also impossible for God to do good to us if we do not open up to do real good, to do the eternal life good. If we don't open up to use the means to get there. Everything in life is done by means. We sometimes picture God as being outside means and things because we just think of, oh, God is this thing that can do everything. But look at all the rest of life, which we're saying is created by God. Everything is by means. I use this example sometimes, but you and I are only able to have this interaction because of all the machines that are in between us. If there wasn't the camera here, that cord there, the Wi-Fi, your device. We couldn't have it. It has to be through means. Go find an example of something not happening through means. And what Swedenborg discovered about the spiritual world, spiritual side of life, is that it's just as means focused as this is. There has to be the intermediary steps that just look at biology. If you say, like, I want to be able to run 200 miles an hour, and you'd have to say, like, well, to do that, look, these muscles, you cannot pull hard enough on this bone to make you go that fast, and your lungs would need to have this much more, like, need to be this big, or whatever it is. That's the way life is built, and even that's the way to eternal life is. That's not to say that God doesn't know how to get us there, but it's just, I don't know, it just pumps me up to think, all right, I can get there faster, or we can get there now. God is sitting there saying, here's the means, live in them. So what I'm going to do, and I invite y'all to do this as well, is live a good life, believe the right things. Think of that as that little power. Okay, where can I do that in little steps here? And knowing that every time we use that gives God the ability to increase that power. Just like the body, as you use it, it gets stronger. So too does this power to use the means and do that sort of stuff. So I think I already said it, but that's the news from heaven. Thanks, everybody. It's so great to get to talk through even this theological stuff with you. And did you know that this is something that can only happen because of your support? No, don't click away. You've got to listen to this whole thing. You may not know that we depend on donor support to create our programming and share the insights and ideas contained in the writing of Emanuel Swedenborg. Well, we do. And we wanted to share an opportunity to support the recently established endowment fund for Off the Left Eye. This fund provides us with the ability to offset the costs of production and staffing. Consider your ability to make a gift. Visit this, otle.causevox.com. That's the way you guys keep this thing going and become part of our community of donors. Thanks to Tim Bilger, our Director of Development, for doing all the good that's allowed us to do things like put on this show and all of our other programming and get these ideas out. And I hope that the idea that we brought in today of the means of salvation and how we can work it goes out with you and brings you light when you're feeling like you need some light, and the kind of light you feel like you can pass on and the world gets a little brighter. Thanks for hanging out.